Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. So, I am going to continue in a series of looking at the labels that are so common. So, the last 4 episodes were on attention issues. Rather, we're going to call it ADD, ADHD, whatever the label, if there's some type of attention issue. I found it really interesting to dive back into the history. And I knew a lot of that history. And that's why I wanted to lay it out for the audience, because sometimes I don't think we truly understand how these labels have come to be. And I find it very interesting. And so I have decided to follow that same format with a few other labels. And right now, today and the next one, I'm going to do the history of dyslexia. Now, I'm going to also preface the history because I want to put some buzzwords in your mind. And especially after looking at this history, I think it's very important that people get this kind of information so that they can look at the broader picture of how these labels came to be, the categories that they're actually placed in, what that means for the child, and is there another picture? So I'm going to encourage you to keep your mind open because, like ADD, dyslexia has also been put in the DSM catalog as a mental health issue. And when we summed up the information on attention, looking at the history, we found that many of the treatments that were eventually put into place, the labels that were put into place, were very much to regulate and create managed care, which is exactly the system that we work in right now. And if that process is okay with an individual, by all means, go in that direction. But my practice of 28 years would tell me there is also a population that believes there has to be something to why a child would not be able to pay attention. And I believe the same thing is true for dyslexia, which typically is thought of as a child who could have issues with reading, spelling, and writing. I think there's a much bigger picture, even to what is called dyslexia today. And by the end of the next podcast, where I give a list of the typical things that show up in the histories of children that are then having problems with the language centers of their brain, I think you'll begin to see the connection that I'm trying to make, that it's important to look at the developmental history, the blueprint, in order to understand how that individual's brain got wired up. We all do not wire up exactly the same. In fact, we have to always keep in mind that the environment, both internal and external, are the greatest influencers of how you are going to get wired. Now, there's always this idea, you read it everywhere, you look at information, the genetic issues. I can tell you right now, there is not a dyslexic gene. There is no gene that has been identified as constituting dyslexia. Could there be familiar tendencies? Absolutely. But this is not a gene. And the thing I really want to help people understand is why we have our raw code of genetic material. It is still going to express based on the environment. Now, things like eye color, hair color, of course, there's two factors. But I come from a family of 6 kids. Mom was what was called a towhead blonde, which is like a whitish blonde. My father, jet black hair. And in this household, there were 2 towhead blondes, 2 dark haired like mine, and one of my brothers, and then 2 like a beautiful mixture of almost everybody. So we have to understand even genes are going to have differences based on the expression, based on what is there. So I'm really encouraging people to look beyond what is being told and begin to ask yourself some questions, especially based on some of the information that I'm presenting to you in the common areas. And we'll get into this after the history. The history is just really long when it comes to the label of dyslexia. So it's actually going to take me 2 podcasts. And then I'm going to get into some other research that I've been following for a very long time, because the common thing that I find when I find children that are dyslexic is that they typically still have primitive reflexes firing, especially the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, which would also impact, I believe, the way that you kind of look at primitive reflexes is the one before and the one after, which in this case it's going to be a couple. It's going to be the palmar, which is for writing. It's going to be the moro, which is going to be that arousal, oxygen issues, and the sympathetic nervous system. It's also going to be the tonic labyrinthine reflex, which is going to really create a lot of core disturbances and gravitational insecurities, toe walking, things of that nature. Primitive reflexes never, ever simply have one firing all by themselves. If one is still firing, there's others still firing because they overlap. So you couldn't possibly just have one. And these reflexes alone are lots of things that I find when I do assessments that are going to impede proper writing. Palmar reflex is how you write how you use an instrument to write, because if you remember, when you put your finger into the baby's hand, the baby's hand closes right up. And the ATNR, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, has to do with the lateral columns of the brain. And then most of the time will interfere with how the child lateralizes, declaring dominance on the same side for the eye, the ear, the hand, the foot. And the children with the label of dyslexia typically have some type of lateralization issue, but especially when it's one of the special senses like the eye or the ear, it just causes all kinds of confusion in the brain. Now, especially if you just happen to get this particular podcast first in your life, I have a whole library of podcasts, and I dive deep into those primitive reflexes. And I think they're very important for people to understand. I think there's more information readily available to people. I've been working in primitive reflexes for over 20 years, and they are the rudimentary place of all learning. You can think of them as the hardwire of your computer. But if something were to happen to you, like a heart attack, a stroke, a brain injury, you too would go back into your brainstem to relearn how to do certain things. So they're a very powerful part of development. They are there for us still. They don't go away. They just quiet down. So they're important to understand. And I'm taking the time at the beginning of this to really help lay some backbone with what I'm about to say, because the thing I don't want to ever come across is that I'm bashing any organization. I'm not. I'm simply looking at the information and I'm offering a different perspective, a more open perspective, I believe, as a healthcare provider of 28 years, and the thousands of kids that I've worked on and the consistent presentations that I've seen. So, if we dive into the history of dyslexia, it looks like it starts around 1883. And it was the first research project that had 5 adult patients, and there were 4 male and 1 female. These were linked to the observations that showed reading problems of each of these individuals who also had developed correctly, but then had some type of brain damage. Okay. So dyslexia was also known as the term alexia. And this is interesting because in the beginning of this history, the biggest part that is repeated over and over and over again is terms. Okay. So dyslexia was also considered alexia, and it was trouble reading usually caused by a brain lesion. That's how it got started. Then it was called word blindness, learning disability that affects reading. Today, this is considered acquired dyslexia. So that was the foundational period around 1880s, okay? 50 years later, terms that started to fall under the same category was aphasia, congenital aphasia, which is the comprehension of the written and spoken word, alexia, congenital alexia, developmental alexia, word blindness, congenital word blindness, strephrosymbolia, which is the disability with symbols and phrases, which was actually a word that one of the researchers created. Reading disability and specific reading disabilities. So around 50 years after the beginning of identifying that there's a population of people that are having trouble reading, typically following some type of brain lesion. Okay. Then we get this burst of many different words, all very similar to having some type of trouble reading, writing, differentiating different types of symbols and phrases. In the 1940s, it really focused on acquired and developmental dyslexia. Acquired dyslexia, also called alexia, referenced adults of normal intelligence and sensory acuity who acquired basic reading and related literacy skills without difficulty. They subsequently experience some type of brain damage induced by such as a stroke, an accident, or infection that impeded these skills. Main population adults. Then we look at developmental dyslexia. Reference those who experienced no brain damage, had no visual, auditory, or mental deficits, but who exhibited unexpected difficulty in their efforts to learn, to read, spell, and write. These learning difficulties were considered to be neurologically based, unfolding over the developmental period, which most children successfully acquire literacy skills. I find that paragraph incredibly interesting. And the reason I do is because it is identifying that it's happening during the development of the child and it is neurologically based. So this is not brain damage. This has to do with how neurocircuits are built. Today, it remains the dyslexia meaning to be more driven by the term developmental dyslexia. Okay. Now, Pringle Morgan, W. Pringle Morgan comes into the scene. And he looked at a 14-year-old young man, and his name was Percy. And everything on Percy appeared to be normal. His intelligence appeared to be normal. And as long as everything could be done verbally, Percy's grades would soar. The only time that Percy was not able to match his intelligence from the auditory of what he heard was to when it had to be translated that he had to read it and write it. Pringle Morgan, the researcher, determined that Percy's problem was defective development, and it did not follow an injury. Very interesting. Okay, so now during the second half of the century, this is where Samuel T. Orton, the co-developer of Orton-Gillingham approach, comes into the scene for dyslexia. The treatment for dyslexia, as outlined by Samuel Orton, who was a neuropsychiatrist, Anna Gillingham, an educator and a psychologist, and Bessie Stillman, who was a classroom teacher, in the 1930s, their focus was to help children learn how to read, spell, and write. And what they did is they drew upon conventional educational practices. They stressed direct instruction, systematic phonics, multisensory teaching, and learning with the basic curriculum. This was the birth of the Orton-Gillingham approach around 1966. So the areas that stood out to me was the idea of drawing upon conventional educational practices. I do like the idea of the multisensory teaching, but they were also following the typical direction of how children are taught. And I personally think this is a huge issue that we don't take into consideration, that children have a really hard time sitting still. and we take them and we put them in a chair and we expect them to sit in this direction for a very long period of time. They may get up and move around for centers, or maybe they even go to another classroom. But what ends up happening is they still spend a great deal of time, in my opinion, in a very rigid environment. A while ago, I just had this conversation with a family that comes to connect my brain. Many years ago, I was not a huge advocate for homeschooling because I met many children who were in the early form of homeschool, and they really did have some issues trying to be with other children. Today, homeschool has been taken to a whole new level, and I really commend the organizations that have come together and brought homeschooling to where it is today. And I think that we're going to have many families go in this direction, especially what has gone on in the last 3 years because of the conventional educational methodology and curriculum that is being forced on our children. When you're in these homeschool environments, instead of just reading about art, you're going to the museum of art. Instead of being just in a gym, you're going outside and you're going on a hike, and everything is so tangible. And these kids are learning at a speed that they really should, because they're meant to be sponges, during these educational years. I also want to highlight and again, this is not to put down the Orton Gillingham approach. Many people I've met have found it very useful, but it is an interesting topic as you go through this history, as you really learn the players that are involved in the way everything is being structured. So, Orton Gillingham approach comes in at 1966. Now, as we look at the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, there is growing opposition from the educational community. The International Reading Association, now it is known as the International Literacy Association, the largest educational advocacy organization promoting reading and bastion of conventional theory and practice in the United States of America. The International Reading Association, also known as the International Literacy Association, so IRA and ILA, has published series that provide a platform for research, theory, and policy, typically reflective of their leadership in the IRA/ILA. Its first dictionary on reading allocated one column to dyslexia. And what it said was, dyslexia has come to have so many incompatible connotations that it has lost any real value for educators except as a fancy word for a reading problem. Consequently, its use may create damaging cause and effects for students, families, and teachers. So, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, there was this explosion of terms, and no one could really agree on the terms. It's been narrowed down to acquired and developmental, but that seemed to be what created a lot of opposition between organizations and educators. So then what happens is we go 14 years later. The second dictionary, that subject of dyslexia, actually received 2 pages and no negative comments, and treated dyslexia as a concept of substance, but some of the arguments still prevail today. Rejection to use of the term dyslexia as a diagnostic tool is widespread in the United States. Some sense of the history and changing attitudes about this resistance is provided by an examination of editions of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM, prepared and published by the American Psychiatric Association, is the dominant diagnostic reference used in the United States. It was first published in 1952 and is now in its 5th edition as we look at this history noted in 2013. It was not until the DSM-4 in 1994 that the term dyslexia appeared in the series, and then it was only listed as one of the several terms to be encountered in the literature. It was in preparation of the DSM-5 that the term received its first notable attention. This initially occurred in an early American Psychiatric Association news release of changes that were expected to be forthcoming. And what was quoted in this release: name changes for categories within the learning disorder section will demonstrate that reading disorder and mathematic disorder categories become dyslexia and dyscalculia. And this was documented in 2011. Shortly following the initial American Psychiatric Association statement, a second and a much different announcement was released. The new American Psychiatric Association position stated that learning disorder has been changed to specific learning disorder, and the previous types of learning disorder, which were dyslexia, dyscalculia, and disorder of written expression, are no longer being recommended. This type of learning disorder will instead be specified as noted in the diagnosis. Well, you can only imagine that this was not received well by the International Dyslexia Association, and they certainly began to communicate their objections. So in the next podcast, I guess I'm creating a bit of a cliffhanger. In the next podcast, that's what I'm going to pick up on, is what happened when they communicated their objections and who the players really were. Now, as a healthcare provider, some of the things that I've learned over the years is parents really do want their child's labeled, identified specifically. Now, before I tell you why, let's just reminisce back on the podcast when we were talking about attention issues. There was a lot of freedom of exploring terms, looking at individuals prior to managed care. And this is really about managed care. When you get a diagnosis, as we've been talking about the DSM, the Diagnostic to Statistical Manual on Mental Disorders, what you're doing is you're getting recognition by the medical community that you have an official diagnosis, and therefore the acceptable treatments that are deemed worthy are connected to those diagnostic codes. And those are the services that you and your child can freely receive through your insurance. But if we back up and we begin to ask ourselves, okay, who has really determined the definition of what this really is, and who has defined the treatment plan? It is the insurance company. And again, this is managed care. And this is what many people would love to see more of in our country under what would be called socialized medicine. However, who determined the definition of what you've got going on, and who defined the therapy? So in 28 years of doing this and watching what families go through and watching the years pass with their child and resolution has not been found, they're heartbroken. So much time is lost in that child's development. And over again, we hear in these descriptions that it's something that went on in development. And development has such a unique picture. And I am a huge advocate that we should be looking at our children before they go into school and determine if they developed correctly. I still feel like a lone ranger out there when it comes to looking at development. We still have a system that if your child doesn't speak, go to speech therapy. If your child isn't walking, let's go to PT. If your child isn't able to button their shirt, let's go to OT. But we're not getting to the root. It's never to put them down. I have great friends in every single one of their categories. I admire every one of them. But when we sit together and talk as colleagues on a professional level, every one of us know that there's a deeper root. And when we get to the deeper root, we can allow that child to move forward. What was it that we heard, how this term even started? It started when one researcher in the 1800s looked at 5 adults who had been able to read, had some type of brain injury that then impacted their reading. How did this get funneled down into children? Very interesting story. Okay, so let's give our particulars so that if we've caught your attention and you want to know more, reach out to Connect My Brain. You can call us at the office, 678-501-5172. Go on the website, send me a message. Give me your question. I love it because I even have moms reaching out from the West Coast hearing these podcasts where they may not be able to come directly to me, but I can certainly feed them some information to get them going in a particular direction. I spoke to a mom the other day, and her interest and her passion, for her own kids, but then for her community. Wow, she should learn more about this. And I actually do coaching on a professional level. I've coached other doctors of chiropractic, I have coached parents, and there is so much information that we can share. And the bottom line is we got to help our kids today more than ever. You know, I mentioned this in another podcast. Children that were born in the last 3 years, they have already predicted will have a deficit of around 20 to 25% of their cognitive ability. Let's not wait to see that happen. Let's start helping our children, and it starts with you. Be blessed.